Good morning. For me, it's actually good evening because I'm heading home, and wanted to talk about something that I missed today. Just a small detail that you know that this Minister of the Security Services of Ukraine was arrested. They call it arrested in absentia because he's not there, so they cannot really arrest him. In Russia, of course, Ukraine refuses. And I, yesterday, somehow, talking about the subject, forgot to mention this. But that's not what I want to talk about now. I want to talk about the trend, the drums of war that are happening, that are sounding in Europe, and particularly in the case of Portugal. Not that Portugal is relevant militarily or economically, by the way, in a war effort. It hasn't been for a while. Even when we had the colonies, I mean, we participated in World War I, and we seen the disaster that was. But now somehow you can feel, you can hear the drums of war, and there are signs. The first sign is that brought to the public discussion, of course, by the populist right wing, it's the mandatory military service. Something which I went through. I had military service when I was young, when I was in my 20s. And then I was there like in 97, 98. But the service ended in 2004. I mean, they saw it was pointless to have this conscript army. Also, the Portuguese economy couldn't handle that big of an army, and many other reasons. People used to complain a lot about that because they wanted to go on with their lives, and that interrupted their course, the course they were taking. Some people liked it. I'll be honest, I wasn't doing much. So when the time came, I just said, okay, let's go. But and I really don't have anything against the mandatory military service if it's reintroduced. Or what I have a problem with is the way that it's being reintroduced. It's not being, don't take me wrong, it's not being reintroduced, but it's being talked about to be reintroduced, to be awakened, and that in the context which this happens, as you all know, it's the context where the West is desperate to achieve victory against Russia. None of this was talked about in the beginning of the SMO. Not in the beginning of the first year, not in the beginning of the second year. But it's starting to be talked about now in Portugal, and by the hand of this, I call it pesky and little thick, little-headed people, which among many of the arguments, because they always have these guys have somehow the mainstream media is always behind them. That's a good lead, I think. And also somehow they have an army of minions in the internet sphere, always then propagating these other sub-narratives or co-narratives that a lot of them are absurd. For example, when they imagine the reintroduction of the military service and young men going through the army because it's good for their discipline and so on and so on, and their motherland calls, it's our sovereignty is at stake. We must maintain an army to defend our nation, and it's a very patriotic thing. And you know, flags like this, they be waving these flags all the time. Of course, if you have a little bit of gray matter inside your skull, you really understand where you stand. And people a couple of decades ago have realized that it was much better to have a professional army where people, if they go there, it's because they want to be there. A small but effective army dedicated to the operations that were really needed to serve the country. Really needed. I mean, I'm not talking about going into Central African Republic and steal diamonds, okay, like it's been happening. There was even a scandal between some Portuguese special forces involved in their doing that. And so when these people, these minions, think about bringing back the army, they always want to discipline the others. It's never themselves. Notice this. It's never themselves. The young men today need discipline. Well, I've passed this phase. I'm not in my 20s anymore, so I think it's only in the scenery of real big catastrophe they would call me. But the people that think the young men have no discipline and they need to be taught a lesson, it's this saying. It's like I don't know, 19th century thought again. I think this mentality came back big time. Napoleonic mentality, imperial mentality, Portuguese imperial mentality, which is kind of a joke. Bear in mind that the latest decades of or even centuries of the Portuguese Empire always had a second-rate role, and of course we could not offend the English too much. When we tried to face them in Africa to make some changes in the map to suit our interests, the English immediately said, you are not allowed to do that, and we had to back down. So it's called the pink map episode in history. Never mind. So now there is being this discussion, and this is like it's a psyop that is happening in society, because bit by bit you start to hear the first voices, the first discussions. And of course, the discussion is brought up in a way that brings up these sentiments of patriotic, ultra-nationalistic sentiments, and of the greatness that we once were when we had an army. I don't know, maybe in the 15th century. There hasn't been. Of course, we had a big army when we had the colonial war in the 60s and 70s. I think we reached 400,000 people in the army, several hundred thousand, which for Portugal was quite a big effort. Of course, it was a peasant army, right? People dragged. Portugal was still a very rural country in that time, and they dragged these people from the rural areas. My father was there, by the way. He was maybe a little bit more fortunate because he had some studies, which was very rare at the time, and he was an officer and not just an average soldier. You know, the soldiers would go to Africa on the, what do you call the lower deck on the ship? Yeah, the lower deck, inside, in the dark. They would travel there. Of course, on their way back, they would refuse to be there. Their eyes were a little bit more open. Again, it doesn't really matter. Rambling now, but just to see that this memory that people pull now when they talk about this, it's fake. There were no glorious days, let alone in the recent past in Portugal. And nowadays, way of fighting, I mean, unless you have a border like Russia, which is the biggest country in the world, and for them it makes sense to have a big army. You see, for example, in this war, they have like 1,000-kilometer front line. They need a big army. They need huge means. But then we're talking about Russia. This is not the reality of Portugal, right? I mean, it would make a little bit of sense if Spain was about to invade. Maybe. Even so, we couldn't. I'm sure we wouldn't last very long, so we would have to resort to other means of resistance. So, and the people in charge realized this, that the army of Portugal, since the colonial war, was never going to be the same. And they were right. They were right. In navy-wise, army branch-wise, they had to adapt to new realities. They needed to specialize more. We don't need numbers. What are we going to do with numbers? Even in the battlefields in Ukraine, you see, you don't have concentrated numbers anymore. Oh, Ukraine made an attack and conquered some trenches, and then you go see the footage of the attack, and it's a couple of BTRs, of BMPs involved in the attack, or Bradleys, or whatever. I mean, the most tanks that I've seen were like, from the side of the Russians, maybe 2 dozens at most of armored cars in one attack. And this is why, because the firepower and the means of detection are so advanced now that if you would go and charge your infantry in big numbers, you would only be causing a big slaughter. The bigger the numbers, the bigger the slaughter. So you have to rely on very specialized, very well-trained units and technology. So I don't really know what's the point now, but the talk is beginning. So it's the psyop is happening, so that people start to discuss, and the arguments, the most stupid arguments, are amplified. This is how populists get to power, by the way. They use very stupid arguments. They lie all the way. They blatantly lie. But somehow the most stupid ideas are the ones that are amplified, and are the ones that resonate with some parts of society. It worries me a little bit, because I have kids, and I really hope it doesn't come to that. And I mean, I really hope that Portugal somehow dodges this. I mean, we've been, of course, we've been on board with everything of supporting Ukraine, but I also understand the context that this government that we have there is just subservient. I mean, they have no free will of their own. And the new government, it's the same. No free will. They're just subservient to NATO and the mandates of the European Union or of the European Commission. So it doesn't really matter. But it was, for example, in Ukraine, yeah, we sent some money. They asked us to send hardware. We sent 3 old tanks, which were not functioning, by the way. So if we keep giving this kind of contribution, maybe we can we can dodge this mess in the name of the Uncle Sam on the other side of the ocean. But most important is that Europe must, the bulk of its citizens must wake up and to avoid this kind of to change the direction which we are heading right now. It's really not healthy. And you see the establishment through the mainstream media pushing on stupidity narratives. Of course, now it's very easy to push. For example, in NAZI Germany, they didn't have to. They only had one channel, right? It was the state channel. You have Mr. Hitler giving these speeches in large rallies, and you have the radio, and so all the stupid ideas had to go through the same channel. They have to put in the same package. Today that wouldn't work very well because of you have to be political the correctness, the political correctness, and you don't want to raise all awareness at once. So you start to talk it mildly in the upper echelons of power, very mildly and very civil, in a very civilized way. Like, but in the lower, well, the ideas are stupid all the same, but the speech is not too harsh. They just talk about that they need to defend ourselves against external menaces. But in the lower echelons of society, I mean, that's where the circus is built, is made, where they talk about the glorious days and all this stupid, and the greatness of bring back the greatness of the empire, Portuguese Empire, the greatness of the nation, and yeah, the Christian values, and yeah, and this is because this is a very big chunk of society that gets influenced by this. We know that when higher echelon politicians in charge, mainly in the European Commission, for example, they talk, but the average people in Portugal, they really don't pay attention to that. But when the minions, this sphere of influencers, start to spread the stupidity, that's when the psyop really gets into action. You could argue that I'm one of these minions, but in the other, walking in the opposite direction. I'm okay with that. I mean, I've been called names before, and it's not really a big deal. I ask you, come, change your direction, come in my direction. Let's strive for peace. Because the people that want the war, one, they don't have any idea what it is to be in the war. I don't have either, but somehow I can imagine that it's not pleasant. But these people, they are just maniacs, psychopaths, right? And second, their kids don't go. I mean, when they ask, do you know this guy Klitschko? You know for sure, if you follow these matters, you know this is the mayor of Kiev. One of the guys chosen by Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt in this famous telephone conversation. He was asked why his kids were not fighting in eastern Ukraine. And his reply was, oh, because unfortunately they are citizens of Germany. Yeah, I mean, do I have to comment on it? I don't think so. And this is Klitschko. Klitschko is one of the puppets there. So, but of course, in order for them to manage Ukraine the way the US wants, they get all these benefits. Their families are safe. They get granted huge sums of money. They embezzle huge sums of money. They safeguard their life and the life of their own, while the average people, the average Ukrainian, is sent to die in the war. So, in Europe, of course, in the beginning in Ukraine, it was the same thing. Slava Ukraina, if you remember, right? You don't see that enthusiasm anymore. by far, by far. So yeah, I don't know if I forgot anything. I need to go to sleep. I see you on the next one. Bye bye.